Welcome to Next in Nonprofits. I'm Steve Boland, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Beth DaPonte. She is the author of a brand new edition of her older book that I want to talk about, but also a practitioner in the world of evaluation. Beth, thank you so much for taking time to join me today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
I heard about the new edition of your book, and we're going to go into some very specific questions and some things about that. The link to more information about the book and where to buy it is in the show notes, so people take a peek at that. But before we get into the specifics of that, can you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners of your background? What brings you into evaluation? What kind of work do you do?
Sure. I started in evaluation in the 90s. My PhD is from the University of Chicago in the sociology department, where I focused on methods and demography. And I found myself at Carnegie Mellon as an assistant professor. And they didn't have a need for a demographer at the time, but they did have a need for somebody to teach evaluation. And I told the dean, I was like, well, I've never done that before. And he said, you could do it. And I took a look at the syllabus, and what do you know? It's more or less quantitative sociology, some demography, a lot of questionnaire design, survey design, which I was fortunate to have done an internship in grad school at the American Medical Association in survey design. So it was a really great match for me. I became really enamored with the field. And at Carnegie Mellon, I was hired to be the survey director for the very first large-scale study on food pantry participants and people who lived in the same neighborhoods as people who used food pantries. So we were asking a lot of very important questions about food pantries and food assistance, all tied to evaluation. We ran one of the first field experiments in that field on why people use food stamps and why comparable people weren't using the food stamp program, looking at the barriers to participation. And from there, my career just kept going on in evaluation. I wrote a book. The first edition of the book was written, I think that was 1995.
Oh, wow.
No, I'm sorry, 2003. Oh,
Oh, okay.
it was 2003. And that was before I went to the United Nations. But no, I'm sorry, it's 2008 was the first edition. But the UN saw the book. People at the United Nations saw the book. They really liked my evaluation approach. I did some workshops at the UN. And eventually I was hired to be chief of section in the Office of Internal Oversight Services, Inspection and Evaluation Division. So all the work that I had been doing with small and medium-sized nonprofits, suddenly it was like on steroids, where I was evaluating the UN's peacekeeping missions. And that was quite the experience, looking at a program with like $1 billion budget, annual budget. So, but it was still evaluation. It was still using the same or very similar approaches that I would use to evaluate a very small nonprofits like community gardening program, taking that same approach. But that approach is asking the questions like, is this program working? Who does it work best for? Uh, why would somebody want to sponsor this program? If you think about donors and the reasons for evaluation, but I'm sure we'll get into that more. So I had my experience at the UN. I started social science consultants and continued my evaluation work, going back to small and medium-sized nonprofits, which they're delightful to work with, and I'm really interested in helping them be as good as they can be in what they do, and to get them to think about on a journey together, think about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how efficient are they in doing it. These are tough questions, but
Hmm.
that all their constituents want answers for. Their constituents, their clients, participants, neighbors, all of their stakeholders want answers to those questions. And then I was interested in writing a second edition of the book, which took into account my UN experience, and also it was just more hands-on. And I thought that's what small and medium-sized nonprofits needed. And so I really wanted to fill that niche. I hope people read it. I hope they, there's a lot of good practical information in it that I hope that they can use. Things like how to hire an evaluator,
Hmm.
especially for small nonprofits. We shouldn't be asking them to devote so many resources to have a whole evaluation department, but maybe they should know how to write a terms of reference for a consultant. And that might be, something that's very practical and needed. So that's kind of the genesis of this edition of the book. And yeah, it was a delight to write. And well, usually it's a delight to write. You get to the last 5% and then you're doing the editing and the proofing and all of that. But it's really great that Wiley chose to publish it and that it's available.
So we'll have a link in the show notes again for this for the book, but evaluation essentials is the title of the book with its subtitle and stuff. But that idea of how to really think through the essential elements that an
Mhm.
organization would need to start thinking about evaluation in a more meaningful way. I feel like this sometimes is a bit of the eat your vegetables moment of the nonprofit sector, though, of, this is something that I think folks that have been doing this work for a while are hearing, you should ought to do this, you should oughta. But does everybody feel that and do that? And as you introed the book, you talked a little bit about a moment where um, asking a nonprofit professional, it's like, well, how do you know if what you're doing is really having the intended results and is working? And getting those answers of, well, I can see it in the program participants' eyes. They can. I just know from talking to
Mhm.
people. Talk to me a little bit about running into
Yeah.
that feeling with people that you talk to about evaluation work.
Yeah, I mean, there's some programs are, especially in the area of food assistance, right? People will have
Hmm.
great, they get food. They aren't asked. They usually aren't asked for anything in return. Um, some programs do ask for people to attend services or maybe have some volunteerism, but those are going to be less and less now. But programs like that, you can see it. You may be able to see it in people's eyes, but what you can't see in people's eyes is whether or not your food pantry is the best food pantry in the area. Like, how is your food pantry going to sustain itself? Will donors flock to your food pantry versus the one, 3 miles away? And what you can't see in people's eyes is efficiency, right? A client may be getting a service, but the sustainability of the organization, whether or not it will be around tomorrow or 3 years from now, could be at risk because they aren't efficient with their resources, right? Or maybe they aren't serving their target population. Let's say a program wanted to target one population. Let's say it's, families with children, but they aren't getting those people in. So you can still see satisfaction in people's eyes, but it's not the population that the program wanted to target. So there's a lot in people's eyes, even when there's joy, thankfulness, appreciation, that an evaluation will cover that eyes don't cover.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think
Yeah.
as you introduce the concept of a more formal process, we do have to sort of set out, where are we trying to get? So to your
Hmm.
point about the food example, it could be just anyone that needs food should be able to get it with, these minimal barriers of this thing, as opposed to folks from a neighborhood, people with kids, whatever the
Hmm.
thing may be. And how do you think through, what does it look like to serve those populations, almost always over some period of time? Pretty early on, you reference some standard thinking in the field of evaluation about a theory of change and about looking at logic models as tools that are more than just today's output. Today's output of, we had 8 families come into the food pantry and they took 100 pounds of food away. That's today's output. And that could be something that a lot of people think about as evaluation. But usually these bigger ideas come to the fore differently. How do you introduce those concepts to people, and how do you talk through getting them excited about having a logic model?
Yeah, I find that people do get excited. I mean, if so, there are different types of people who use evaluation and who contract evaluations, right? Some of them are the boards of organizations. They may want um, an evaluation conducted. Some of them are like the executive director, the head person in an organization may want to examine what it is they're doing, why they're doing it, the efficiency of what they're doing, but also the donors. Donors typically want an evaluation, especially if they're donating large sums of money. So foundations, more and more are getting into the evaluation game. More and more of them are developing evaluation policies because they have a constituency that they need to report to. They need to report to their boards, and if it's a family foundation, they need to report to the family. Like, what did you do with the money
Mhm.
that you distributed, and how effective was it on the community? But I found that if I talk, and other evaluators, I think will tell you the same thing, that when you go into an organization and ask them, what are you doing? Like, what is this program about? So let's talk at the program level rather than the whole organization level. Let's
Right.
say they're running a particular program. And if you ask them, like, why are you running this program? They'll be able, usually they can articulate a story of why they're a theory of change, of how they think having this program operating will somehow bring good to the world, right? And usually they're excited. You know, if you press them a bit more, like sometimes they'll be thinking just short term. Like if we advertise, if we, we can, if people know about our services, they'll come, they'll be served by us in some way. And then you can ask the question, well, then what happens to them? Like, why do you want to serve them? And eventually, if you kind of connect the dots, eventually you get to somehow a better community, a better world. You know, we all want to be doing things that make the world better. Um, and people are excited to talk about that. What I'm always surprised at, um, with very few, I shouldn't say always, but almost always surprised at, is how much literature reviews around whatever theory they articulate, how much having an external person, it can be an internal person too, but how much having an evaluator actually tell them about how good their theory is, what we know about their theory in the literature. They're usually people are very informed by that. And based on their theory and a literature review, they may change the way they think about their program,
Hmm.
depending on the results of that literature review. Sometimes a literature review will verify what they've thought about their program, what they've been doing from the start. Sometimes it won't, and then they have to, and then they're surprised by that. So it always surprises me that they haven't looked at the literature on this, but it shouldn't surprise me because, that's not their job. Their job
Well,
is
it's
to
not.
implement a program. But having that conversation, that bigger conversation about what is it you're doing, why are you doing it, it it broadens and it brings a level of um, I shouldn't say competence, but it brings a level of curiosity to the program that maybe didn't exist before.
So I do think that looking at that framework, though, that the especially the logic model kind of thing, and I want to
Hmm.
ask you a very specific question about that from later on in the book. But right now, that idea of today's outputs are, this many families took this much food away. Okay,
Hmm.
but is the point of providing food to people just so that they have food for that day? Is the point of having that food shelf available something else than that?
Hmm.
Do people just stop there going, well, we distribute food, people need food? I mean, do they just kind of assume like this is obvious? Why do we need to look at more effective ways of getting food to people? Don't you just get food to people? If they've never done a literature review, if they've never thought about what's a longer term outcome that they might be looking at, how do you help them envision thinking about more outcome-based pieces rather than output-based opportunities?
Yes, that can be, but that can go both ways, right? So
Hmm.
you could then so sometimes programs will start saying, I want to, I don't know, increase people's life chances, and one way of doing it is providing food. Then the
Hmm.
evaluator might say, well, is the intensity, are you actually providing enough services to see this big outcome that you want? You want to change people's life trajectories, especially for kids. And the way you're doing it is providing food. Okay, that's one good thing to do, but you may want to supplement it with other services because just food by itself isn't necessarily going to get you there. And then the other way of looking at that is if we provide food, if we provide food, then maybe we're increasing food security. And then the
Hmm.
evaluator may say, well, you're actually kind of doing, the literature review will show that they're doing actually a lot more than that. And so it gets people to think even broader about their programs. But balancing, you know, the intensity of services and complementing services with the ultimate goal that a nonprofit would like to achieve. I mean, this is a balancing act, but these are the questions that come out in an evaluation. Are our services intense enough to achieve the goals that we want to achieve for our nonprofit? Maybe we don't need to provide the intensity of services that we're already providing. Maybe we could achieve those goals and not have all of, not provide this whole array of services.
Yeah.
So there could be a fine line in terms of being as efficient as possible with the monies that the nonprofit is a steward of.
Well, and there's a couple of ways that I wanted to get to this question. So this is a nice lead into thinking about both the illustration of a literature review may enlighten these other program opportunities that contribute to the end state that we're looking at here, these outcome goals, and that may shape what the program looks like. And I think that that's very interesting. But there's also um, the difficulty of collecting that data, the availability of data, the cost of all of that data may narrow things a little. Like, well, we really can't understand this full big
Yeah.
impact that we want to understand because it's just not practical to do a 30-year longitudinal study. We just don't have that available to us for any number of good reasons. So knowing that, as you talk in your book about the logic model, sometimes that outcomes conversation may shape kind of from the other direction of, well, this is the stuff that we can ask about,
Yeah.
track, think through, and therefore let's, try to talk about our program in that context, even if there are these bigger contexts. That's hard to think through. What are we going to
Hmm.
weigh based on how much time, energy, capacity, expertise do we have to bring to just the evaluative work? Because it seems to
Hmm.
me like most nonprofits would love a 30-year longitudinal study on what they're doing.
No,
That
they
would be
wouldn't.
great. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Tell me
No.
about that. Why wouldn't they?
No.
What do you think?
Because they don't want an evaluator in their hair that long.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
they wouldn't have the
no.
same one for 30 years, probably, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Not me anyway, not at this age.
right.
Uh, yeah, the whole data collection. So let's say we have our theory of change and we hope that providing some services is going to change people's life outcome, and we aren't going to follow them for their life. Well, then we need to look at what our theory is and then think about where in this whole chain of events can we stop collecting data? And where do we need to devote data collection resources? There's some questions that come out of a theory of change are going to be no-brainers, right? So if I provide food, so I might have my theory of change. If I provide food, then people will cook it at home and X, Y, and Z. Eventually, they'll be able to avoid eviction because they're able to pay the rent because they're getting this food resource. And then although eviction has all terrible, um, terrible consequences, especially for children, right? Um, we're not going to track all the way down. We're
Right.
going to, and we aren't going to track whether the degree to which people cook at home with the food that they're given. That's kind of going to be the no-brainer. We might track things like their food security. And hopefully, the evaluator will track that because that government data is no longer available. It used to be available. The Trump administration has decided not to collect any more data on food security in the United States. So, so that would be, that would be a measure that you would want to collect. But then there is the real question about how much money can a nonprofit put into data collection, and what is this going to cost? And it's the evaluator's job to come up with a practical, lean data collection approach that will that will give just as much data as they need to answer the questions and no more. You don't want extraneous information that you're not going to use. So at the outstart in an evaluation, you want to have a good evaluator who can help you develop or show your theory of change. And that will be the way that everybody starts talking about your program. And that will help you think about what it is you would do to show that your program is actually up and running. So those are measures like numbers of clients, numbers of trainings given, numbers of bags of food given out, those are the things, so that we call those the outputs. And then the outcomes. What's the result of doing what you're doing? And we can think about qualitative measures like focus groups, talk to people, do interviews. What I don't want to see done are client satisfaction surveys because they tend to be biased. The clients often don't know whether they should be satisfied or not. They are grateful. Um, but then you start thinking about what measures should be collected and how can you develop those measures. And can you use other data? It could be like data on, people then get jobs or they get, whatever the program is.
Right. You know, as you're talking about what data to evaluate and how to make that, there's that practical constraint of cost that is just there,
Mm-hmm.
and time and energy and all of the things
Yeah.
that are involved. I mean, money is all kind of measured in terms of, the amount of human power and all these other things. Um, I I saw you referencing in your book this idea of an evaluation reference group of, say,
Mm-hmm.
no more than 15 or so stakeholders that
Mm-hmm.
could help you through that part of this work. And as much as I like to think I've, seen some program evaluation stuff, I've never really thought about that facet you're recommending in the essentials here of helping you to broaden your thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
these things. So can you talk about the usefulness of establishing a group like that and how one goes about it?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in having some sort of evaluation reference group. It doesn't need to be as large as 15 people. I'd go from 5 to 15, no larger than 15. It gets hairy. But you need to have a broad array of stakeholders at the table to help you think through and to have access to people who first help you think through the evaluation questions that the evaluation will be answering, to prioritize those evaluation questions, and then also to give you access for data collection. So you should have people, somebody who represents the community, or more than one person who represents the community at large. Maybe people who represent the clients or who are the clients of the program, the funders. But you have to be careful with funders because sometimes, they carry a lot of cachet and they sometimes will quiet other other voices at the table unintentionally. So sometimes they need to be treated separately, or included separately. Sometimes not, depends on the personalities. The program implementers, like what are people seeing day to day, the people who are actually carrying out the program. So you want a wide variety of voices at the table. And those people they'll be reading the drafts of everything that an evaluator creates. They'll be giving feedback. They'll help advertise implement the evaluation recommendations at the end of the day. But they'll have skin in the game in the evaluation, and they're so important throughout the whole process. Otherwise, if an evaluator is just creating an evaluation for an executive director or just for one board, oh, you would want board members on the evaluation reference group also, but they're also, members of the community, and they
Hmm.
have other roles too. But if you're just doing it internally for the program itself, there's a risk that if the evaluation, let's say it's like we call it a summative evaluation. That's like a report card evaluation. That's like the program did or didn't achieve its goals. Um, let's say it's a negative evaluation. Let's say that there are things in the program that really needed to be improved. It could still be a very valuable evaluation, but sometimes people feel very threatened by those results and they want to bury, and evaluations sometimes get buried. You don't want that happening. An evaluator shouldn't want that happening. And our evaluators' time is limited too, and so we want to see programs excel, and we want to see our recommendations that we've thought about very carefully. We want to see those implemented. And the evaluation reference group, that's who you deliver the evaluation to. They've seen the drafts. They've been part of the process. They know how the evaluation was constructed and the different decisions made along the line. And so they will help you at the end. They will help the
Right.
program at the end. Yeah.
So, one thing I think that as you talk about a group like this that can be helping along the way, something that I think seems challenging to me anyway is this idea of setting out, laying the groundwork is one of your chapters here, setting out to say these are the things that we're going to evaluate over this period of time, and the temptation to think, well, that's what we're interested in learning, but the government funder wants this information gathered, or, it's easier to get this other thing, or whatever the things may be. And it feels to me like sometimes over a period of time with that group go, well, I don't know. I mean, it's so messy, it's so hard. Maybe we should just stick with this output stuff and build a story around that, retroactively kind of construct that's what we were looking for because it was the data that the government folks wanted us to collect or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Laying the groundwork sounds great, but over time, is there just some pressure to go, well, we couldn't do the thing we thought we could do, and now we're going to switch gears and try and measure something else instead?
I am a big believer that right now, what I'm seeing in the field is more and more interest in evaluation and really knowing what the impact of organizations is. If you are the organization that isn't on that bandwagon and the others are, guess who's going to get funded in the long run? It's going to be the organizations that can show they've had an impact, that they've had real impact, or who can show their theory of change, or can show exactly what their goals are, or what their target population is for their program, that they aren't just trying to serve the whole world. Um, you will fall behind. You will fall behind, and you might not notice it the first year, the second year, but eventually the funders, the donors, in the community will flock to the programs that they think are most effective. So, yeah, I guess you could just, keep reporting on outputs. We gave out,
It
X,
just
Y,
feels
and
like
Z.
over a
Yeah.
period of time, there's going to be things don't always go, despite trying to lay the best groundwork you can lay.
Yeah.
Things don't always go the way. I mean, in the last few years, as I was just talking a little while ago with somebody
Yeah.
else about COVID happens, and you're like, well, we had intended to measure all of these in-person things, and now we can't,
Mm-hmm.
and it
Mm-hmm.
was going to be over this period of time, or we're recording this in February of 2026, and I'm in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly half of the grade school students in Minneapolis aren't going to school anymore because they don't feel it's safe. It's not safe
Mm-hmm.
to leave their homes and to go into those buildings. There were a
Yeah.
lot of people that were probably planning to evaluate impact on kids that are just not there to participate through the length of the whole thing that maybe somebody had intended. When those things
Mm-hmm.
come up, I feel like there's a natural tendency to just kind of move the goalposts after the fact. And um, how do you adapt when the world
Yeah.
changes out from under you and you just can't get the stuff that you laid that groundwork so carefully for?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good question. But everything that you just mentioned to me were opportunities.
Hmm.
Like COVID happening, that's an opportunity to learn how do we deal when there's an emergency like this. And yes, it put a wrinkle into what our first goals were. I was actually um, working with a program and at a funders, and they were just selecting the participants for this it was supposed to be a 3-year program. It got extended by a year when the week before the shutdown occurred. But COVID, that became part of the story of why
Huh.
they could not implement everything that they intended to do. And what could they have done better? Well, I actually think they did the best that they could under the circumstances. But, having those caveats, otherwise you're looking at results without taking into account what actually was going on in the world. Minneapolis right now, where children aren't going to school, well, that's going to be very important to document. And how does that affect learning outcomes? Well, we know from COVID. Right. We know from COVID that learning outcomes were greatly affected. I don't know if I haven't looked at the Minneapolis data, but overall, learning outcomes were greatly affected when
Yep.
there wasn't in-person school. So do we see that result again? And what can we do to mitigate that result? And I mean, in Minneapolis now, are they doing a lot of online schooling?
Right. That's the
Education to mitigate. And so that was one of
yeah.
the lessons learned from COVID. Like, that's better than nothing, but it's not in person.
Right.
So, yeah, all of those things are learning opportunities. But another function of evaluation is also to record program history. People forget, programs forget why they made changes. Like, oh, we
Hmm.
used to do it that way, and then we made this change. Well, why did you make that change? And when did you do that? So I do encourage nonprofits for each of their programs to create what we call a program logic model, where you specify what the goals are of the program are, what assumptions you're making about the program. Everybody makes assumptions. Um, but what assumptions you're making, what resources you had for the program, what its target population was, what its outputs are, outcomes and outcome measures, and to put a date on that and to revisit that quarterly because it tells you about the program's history. And it's important to know the program's history because then you aren't as dependent on people for institutional memory. And it's important for organizations to have records
Yeah.
of that.
So, Beth, we are already starting to run low on time. I know it's like
Wow.
we're not even halfway through the book. We haven't gotten to some of the major sections that you've laid out, and we're going to have to kind of move a little bit along here. One
Okay.
thing I did want to check in on before we lose too much time is a whole chapter on causation, which just immediately warmed my heart when I saw in the book because I should also link to the XKCD cartoon that has, verified my
Yeah.
life around that. The idea that people can conflate causation and correlation so often, and or just not really get an understanding of where their role is in creating the change that they want to see happening. So, you gave it a whole chapter in the book. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of establishing causation and what you think about in program work that way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we all talk about a program causing a change, right? Somebody went to this program and voila, they got a job. And, Nobel Prize winners have spent their careers looking at the issue of selection, Are you sure it was the program that caused that change, or was it just that the program attracted people who would have gotten a job anyway? They attracted the cream of the crop, and they didn't actually reach their target population. So, I want to be a sponsor. I want to donate to a program that does cause change, but for an evaluation to for an often in an evaluation process, we can't actually say it caused change, that a program caused change. We can say that it seems that there was change in the program participants or that it contributed to that change, but you need to be very cognizant of what else is going on in the world. Did participants get other programs at the same time? Um, it, did you just simply select a particular group of participants? Were particular people interested in this program? One of the programs I'm very critical of is a program that gives books to people, right? It goes out and it gives books to people, just kind of whoever's interested in getting a book. It's for children's it's children's books that are being given, but anybody who's interested can get a book for their child. Well, often it's the people who would have been at the library who would have, who would
Mhm.
participate in that book. In fact, in my local library, they're a big sponsor of this program, or they're a big advocate of this program. That's great, but it's not necessarily getting more books to people if the only people you're reaching are people who go to public libraries. So it may look like the program is very effective because those are
Right.
the same kids who might have higher reading scores, but the program ultimately could have no effect. So struggling with those issues are things that should come out in a good evaluation. And, we can never say with certainty that any program caused a particular change, but we can start making the case that
Right.
sometimes it could be that had it not been for this program, if this program didn't exist, maybe there would be no change in participants, and that this program actually kept people from getting worse, from their status getting worse. And that could be a very positive thing for a program. But yeah, there's a whole chapter that goes through all of those issues. And when I used to teach evaluation at Yale and at Carnegie Mellon, those were the lectures that people really struggled with, is the idea of causation. And then once you think about causation, then you can think about what what are the risks? What are the threats to showing causation? Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's the end state outcome thing that is very sometimes difficult to go, our one intervention here did that. But you talk
Yeah.
about necessary and sufficient in the book as measures that are um, potentially a little bit more refined or defined than just, this person had a successful life and never went to jail. I'm like, okay, well, that's great, but that's a lot. As opposed to this is a necessary component to kind of sufficiently show this thing. Does that framework help kind of anchor people in this?
I think so. Because
Yeah,
you can ask, even if a program caused a change, you could say, well, is this the only program that would have caused that change? So was it necessary? And then the sufficient is, well, everybody who went through this program or who got this benefit, did they show that change? And so, like, if you look at things like food stamps, not everybody who gets food stamps is food secure. A lot of people who get food stamps become food secure, but some don't. So is it sufficient? No. Is it necessary to get food stamps to be food secure? No. Actually, a lot of poor people are food secure and they don't get food stamps. But overall, it seems that food stamps help families become food secure.
yeah,
So, these are questions that evaluators struggle with. I think program managers struggle with when they go home and they say, did I make a difference? And often the answer is yes. Did I make a difference for everybody? Often that answer is, probably not. And you probably didn't make the same difference for everybody.
right.
So, yeah. These are
So,
important
given just
questions.
a few minutes of time left, I want to jump to the validity chapter and talk a little bit through external validity specifically. There's so much more in this chapter that we just don't even have the time to scratch. But I do
Mhm.
think that part of the conversation, I think, may weigh more on the person that's thinking about picking up this book and starting a process. How do you talk about your construct, your internal, but more specifically this external validity in the work?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So external validity is the degree to which this is what you find about your program is generalizable to others. And this is especially important when you're picking up literature and you're asking, well, they found this in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Is this relevant in Toronto? Yeah, or they found that this program is effective for people 25 to 34 years old. Is it going to work? Is the same approach going to work for the elderly? So that would be external validity. Um, so that's most important in literature reviews. Program managers are typically more interested in internal validity. Did our program cause the change? And then there's the idea of construct validity. What is it that our program represents? That's a harder concept to think about, but what is it that yeah, what is it that our activities, what is this theoretical idea that our activities actually represent? And there's statistical conclusion, which is just simply like, are our statistics, are our measures, is our data analysis good? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
if you've never had a stats class and had to get through a standard deviation conversation with somebody before, it's worth the exercise of learning about some of those things to be at least a little conversant in how do we know that when we're making this leap from this group of people to another group of people that can be
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. I have to say, but the book is not statistical. Like it touches on stats a bit, but it really, yeah, I try to avoid that. And I also encourage people to hire a statistician if they get to that point, if they really needed one. But a lot of the questions that nonprofits are trying to answer are, um, yeah, statistically they're simpler. Conceptually they're difficult, and in reality, looking at just trying to apply good practices, it becomes difficult too. Yeah,
That may have to be kind of our coda here.
yeah,
Because,
yeah.
unfortunately, we're just out of time. There's so much more in the book. So links are in the show notes. Go take a peek, learn more there. You can also have a link to the socialscienceconsultants.com where you can learn more about Beth and how to get in touch with her. But I guess given our time is closed, I will just
Yeah.
say thank you to Dr. Beth
Thank you
DaPonte,
so
who
much.
is the author of this book. I really appreciate you taking time today.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate you. Keep warm.